Oh, hi. Welcome to the Lawrence L. Lee Scouting Museum and the Max I. Silber Scouting Library here at Camp Carpenter in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm Joe Bedrisky. I'm the Communications Director and Volunteer Coordinator here. And I'd like to take you inside and show you the collection and give you a little bit of the history of scouting as well as the history of this museum itself. One of the things we're going to do is concentrate specifically on the requirements for Scouting Heritage Merit Badge, one of 137 scouting adventures and special merit badges that can be earned as scouts advance through the ranks. It's a relatively new merit badge, but it's one that we're very well equipped to teach here, and 6 of the docents who are on staff as volunteers are actually registered merit badge counselors for Scouting Heritage Merit Badge. So come on inside, let's take a look. Welcome inside. I want to tell you a little bit about Scouting Heritage Merit Badge, first of all, for those of you who are following this for the sake of earning that. A couple of things that you need to have. One is the Scouting Heritage Merit Badge worksheet. This becomes your Bible, and things we're going to talk about in the next half hour or so, you will want to write down in this and then discuss with your merit badge counselor. And a very helpful resource to have is the Scouting Heritage Merit Badge book. This is available at the Scout Shop and here at Camp Carpenter and anywhere where scouting supplies are sold. Virtually everything you need to know for the merit badge is included in here, including some things that we won't talk about here today. The museum itself started over 50 years ago. It was August of 1969. And this gentleman on the wall, Lawrence Lee, was the council executive of Daniel Webster Council. He and another scouting legend from New Hampshire named Max Silber from Nashua were good friends, and between them they had amassed quite a huge collection of personal scouting artifacts in their many years and many travels. They thought, wouldn't it be great to have a repository for all of this so that the scouts of the future would have something to look at and a way to better understand where scouting came from and how it developed, especially here in New Hampshire. The idea came to fruition, however, unfortunately, after Mr. Lee passed away, Max took the realm and decided to name the museum in Lawrence Lee's memory. So that is why we are now known as the Lawrence L. Lee Scouting Museum. The original museum was this little cabin in the woods over on the other side of the parking lot here at Camp Carpenter, right on the shores of Long Pond. It was only 1,100 square feet originally. Over the course of the first 10 years, they filled up that space with their collection, and then they built on an addition. In subsequent years, they built another building elsewhere here in camp that is our conservancy that holds a lot of things that are not actively on display. And in the summer of 2015, we moved everything by hand across the parking lot in the heat of the summer sun to the space that we will show you in this virtual tour. So scouting itself was the idea of Sir Robert Stevenson Smythe Baden-Powell. Today we just call him BP for short. He was a highly decorated and respected colonel of the British Army at the end of the 1800s and into the first decade of the 1900s. As a military colonel, Powell had led many British Army troops, which is why we still have troops of Boy Scouts today. And his troops were composed of man soldiers and boy scouts. Now, the Boy Scouts were actually part messenger, part spy to some extent. And sometimes they'd be sent in advance of the troops out a couple of days to see where the enemy was, how many horses, how many guns, how many men they had, and then come back and report that to the troops. The scouts had to know how to get along in the wild as a result. And so they had to be able to navigate with a compass and with the stars at night. They had to know how to draw and follow maps so they could recreate where they had been to show the other men in their units. They also had to know how to track animals, fish, hunt, cook and eat for themselves, clean up well, pitch a campsite for nighttime, and camp safely, also to be able to take care of any injuries that happen along the way using rudimentary first aid. And it is no coincidence that those are the basic skills that scouts today learn as soon as they join the organization and get into the outdoors. And there is a book that Baden-Powell wrote that talks about all of those skills and helps to teach these young boys how to do those things out in the woods. Now, when I talk about Boy Scouts, of course, today I include the girls who are members of Scouts BSA. But in Baden-Powell's army, the boys who were scouts were taught with this little red book called Aids to Scouting. And they really proved their worth. Probably nowhere better than at Mafeking, a little village in Africa, where between 1899 and 1900, for a total of 217 days, Baden-Powell and his troops defended that town against the attacking Boers in what came to be known as the Boer War. At the end of the Boer War, Baden-Powell came home a war hero and was celebrated throughout England, in the city streets and in the countryside as well. What he did was take the little red book, Aids to Scouting, and rewrote it to take out a lot of the military aspects of it, and created the blue book called Scouting for Boys, which is essentially the very first edition of the Boy Scout Handbook. Because he found that the kids in the streets of London were actually using the book and playing some of the games in it in order to learn the skills that it taught. One of the things that manufacturers of the time did was to put BP's likeness on their products, because he had a higher profile and was more popular with the public than some of their products were. So you see him on plates and glasses and little trays. There's something here called the Mafeking Hyposcope, which is a little telescope. That's a biscuit tin, even a lady's purse there that has his likeness on the front of it. And many of these items, over in this other case, actually came from Baden-Powell's home. They were given to Max Silber by Lady Olav Baden-Powell, BP's widow, after he passed away. Of most interest are these hand-drawn sketches, which were done by the original hand of the founder of Scouting himself, Baden-Powell. There are very few of those in the world. They are all one of a kind, and we are very proud to have them here at the Lee Scouting Museum. There is another display in the back of the room that has some more of those on it, as well as some of his watercolor paintings. Some of these other things are things that are particular to his home and to Scouting, including some old photographs. Baden-Powell had originally intended for Scouting to be for boys between the ages of 11 and 15. But popular demand led to the establishment of programs for boys who were both older and younger than that, and a separate scheme for girls. It's important to note that Baden-Powell is also the founder of Girl Guides, which years later, in much the same way that Boy Scouting came to America, the Girl Scouts of America were formed in Savannah, Georgia. In all cases, the training for Scoutmasters was one of the most important things. Baden-Powell felt that all of the adult leaders should be very skillfully trained in what they were going to train younger people to do as well. And that picture that we were just showing is actually one of the first Scoutmaster trainings, taking a course that eventually became what is Wood Badge training today. To put the history of the time in perspective, this was the age of the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of people were moving away from the countryside and the woodlands and into the cities, which is where the work was. However, a lot of them actually didn't have places to live, and so people were living on the streets, and that's where Baden-Powell found a lot of the youth of the time using his book, Aids to Scouting, to play the games and learn the skills that he had taught his soldier boy scouts. Because you see, in those days, not everybody was physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. And Baden-Powell felt that those were qualities that should be developed in the youth and in the society of the day. So to formalize some of that training for the youth, Baden-Powell did something that had never been done before. He took a group of 22 boys, drawn from different classes of society, to Brownsea Island off the coast of England. This was 1907, and that was really the very first ever Boy Scout campout. They played games, he taught them skills, they lived and slept and cooked and ate in the out of doors, and it was all strictly an experiment to see if his idea of scouting, which he described as fun with a purpose, would actually work. I often think about the parents of the day giving their sons over in complete faith to this man, in much the same way that parents today do when your son comes home and says, "Oh, the Scoutmaster's going to take us out in the woods and go camping for the first time." So all of this that I've told you about Baden-Powell and the founding of Scouting is why the very first requirement for Scouting Heritage Merit Badge reads as follows: to discuss with your counselor the life and times of Lord Baden-Powell of Gilwell. Explain why he felt a program like Scouting would be good for the young men of his day. And include in your discussion how Scouting was introduced here in the United States and the origins of Boy Scouting and Cub Scouting under Baden-Powell. So the year was 1907, And scouting began in earnest in England with the experiment at Brownsea. 3 years later, in 1910, a young William D. Boyce, a newspaper publisher from Chicago, had to go to London on business. Now, London, you might know, is notorious for something which is bad weather. It is foggy and rainy there much of the time. Boyce literally got lost in the fog in London and did not know how to get to where he was trying to get to, a business meeting. A young man who was dressed probably a little bit like this guy came along and said, "How can I help you, sir?" And he took Mr. Boyce to his destination because he knew the city by heart, even in the fog. When they reached the destination, Boyce reached into his pocket to give the young boy a tip. And the boy went, "No, no, thank you very much, sir, but I'm a scout. That's my good deed for the day." Well, Boyce thought that was a wonderful idea because he had 35,000 paper boys back home who he wanted to find a way to keep busy when they weren't delivering his papers. So ultimately he arranged with the boy to meet Baden-Powell. He got the lowdown on this thing called scouting and brought the idea back to America in the early months of 1910. The first person he contacted was Mr. James West. West was appointed as the very first ever Chief Scout Executive of the Boy Scouts of America in early 1911. West said originally, "I will help you to get this organization off the ground. I will commit 6 months of my time to it." He ultimately was the Chief Scout Executive for 33 years. And he's probably the very first example of the dedicated adults who are in scouting today in almost every council throughout the country and in districts right here in New Hampshire as well. There were two other people very important to the foundation of scouting here in America. They already had organizations that were happening. And if you come around the corner, we'll talk a little bit about who they were and what they were doing. Ernest Thomas Seton was born in Scotland, but came to America and developed at a very early age in the 1880s a fascination with the way of life of the Native Americans. He subsequently went on to become a naturalist, a writer, an artist, a lecturer. He was a man of many talents. And so he formed a group that would take young boys out into the woods and teach them the kinds of skills that he had developed and that he had such an affection for. His rich background made him a logical choice for Chief Scout when the Boy Scouts of America was formed in 1910. His scoutcraft became an integral part of scouting with a group known as the Woodcraft Indians. The other player was Daniel Carter Beard. He was a woodsman, an illustrator, and a naturalist himself. And his was the pioneering spirit that became the Boy Scouts of America. To boys, he represented the American frontier, the broad western prairies, the unexplored mountains and rivers. He was already 60 years old when BSA was founded, and he had a group that was known as the Sons of Daniel Boone, named after the legendary character from stories of the great outdoors of that era. Uncle Dan, as he was known to boys and leaders, is remembered throughout the annals of scouting history as one of the guiding lights who gave birth to the great program of scouting here in the USA. So I'm standing now in Cub Scout Corner, where we have a great selection of some of the international Cub Scout uniforms from countries around the world, and an entire history of the Cub Scouting handbooks, from the very first ones to the most recent publishing. Cub Scouting came along later on in 1930 here in America, as it had come later after Boy Scouting in England, because it was the first step in expanding the reach of scouting to boys of different ages who also wanted to get involved in this program. Now, requirement 2 for the Scouting Heritage Merit Badge asks you to give a short biographical sketch of any of 2 of the 5 people that they list. We've already talked about 4 of them: Daniel Carter Beard, William D. Boyce, Ernest Thomas Seton, and James E. West. And if you don't know what a biographical sketch is, well, you should look it up online or talk to maybe your history teacher or an English teacher at school, because basically it is a word picture of someone. It tells us who they were, where they came from, and what they did to make a contribution to society in their lives. There are biographical sketches of 4 of the 5 people that you can choose from right here in the Lee Scouting Museum, and we will show you the text of those after this video in kind of a video appendix. So you can transcribe that information to your Scouting Heritage Merit Badge workbook. Don't forget that this is a very interactive merit badge. All of these things that I'm telling you, you're going to have to tell back to a counselor before he will sign off that you have fulfilled the requirements. So we want to know that you've actually learned this stuff. It's not just to sit home and listen to me talk about them on television. The fifth of the people that you can give a biographical sketch of is Waite Phillips. Waite Phillips is the gentleman who is responsible for there being a Philmont Scout Ranch in Cimarron, New Mexico. Have you ever passed a Phillips 66 gas station? There aren't too many of them left in the country. But Phillips had brothers, and each of them had their own oil company. Actually, Phillips had a twin. He was Waite Phillips, W-A-I-T-E. His twin brother was Wyatt Phillips, W-I-A-T-E. Wyatt passed away at a very young age, but Waite went on to be very successful in the oil business. So successful that he basically bought a big corner of New Mexico as his summer home. It was over 40,000 acres originally, and he built a home there and used to take movie stars and politicians and friends from all over the country into the woods, hiking and camping and hunting and doing all of those activities. Subsequently, he found some boys camping on the land one day and stood back rather than rousting them and said, finally went up to them and said, "How do you know how to do what you're doing out here in the woods without getting hurt or without anything bad happening?" And they said, "Oh, well, that's because we're Boy Scouts." So that was his introduction to Boy Scouting. Long story short, fast forward to when he's ready to retire, he gave his entire piece of land in New Mexico to the Boy Scouts of America, and that is how it became Philmont Scout Ranch. Interesting story of philanthropy and magnanimity. He tried to give it to Scouting the first time, and Scouting said, "Oh, that's a very generous gift, but we have no way to maintain that land, so no thank you." What they didn't know was that Phillips also owned an office building in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which he then went back and through legal measures had deeded to the Boy Scouts of America, went back to them and said, here's my office building. Now, I'll pay you rent. You can use that money to build up the ranch. So here's Philmont. And they ended up with both. Requirement 2B for the Scouting Heritage Merit Badge asks you to discuss the significance to Scouting of any 2 out of 4 things. One of them is Brown Sea Island, which we talked about up in the front. That was the experiment of the very first ever Boy Scout campout. The other is the first World Jamboree, which I'll talk about in a minute when we step back into the international room. A third is the Boy Scout Handbook. And here at the museum we have a complete set of the history of the Boy Scout Handbook. There are now 13 editions over time, going all the way back to 1911, when the first one was published. It has changed through the years because the skills that Scouts learn have changed. You will find in some of the early ones things that are no longer part of it, but you will find in the later ones newer skills that didn't even exist back in the early days of Scouting. In addition to having a sample of each of the editions of the Scouting Handbook, we have samples of each subsequent printing of each edition of the handbooks in the lower part of the case, because sometimes subtle changes would be made, and before the entire book was changed, content-wise, a second or third edition would come out with just little things changed. One of the examples of that is this 5th edition that came out between 1948 and 1958. Originally, the 5th edition looked like this, and it showed Scouts in the light khaki-colored uniform and the campaign hat like the one I had on at the beginning of this video. After World War II, Scouting uniforms changed, and so the cover of this same edition of the handbook changed to show the styles that were more popular with the soldiers in World War II, with the what's called a field cap and a more olive green uniform. The story of Boys Life magazine is very interesting, and that's one of the things that you can tell to fulfill requirement 2B. Boys Life came about because of a Boy Scout. The parents of the time had their magazines. Men had things like Outdoor Life and hunting and fishing magazines, and the women had Good Housekeeping and Better Homes and Gardens. And the boys wanted to have something that was specific to their interests. So a young boy wrote the very first edition of Boys Life magazine. Subsequently, the Boy Scouts of America bought the rights to publish it, and they've been doing so every year since 1911. Here at the museum, we have a whole bunch of the latter-day issues that are available for you to look through. And if you come down here to look at this case with all these big blue volumes in it, this includes a copy of every edition of Boys Life ever published since 1911. That's part of the unique collection here at the Maxi Silber Scouting Library, named for the other founder of the library, Max Silber. And while we're here, let me tell you a little bit about him. This is his legacy wall. This is the man that we knew as Uncle Max, and these are all of his personal pieces of regalia. A very decorated scout and scouter. He was an Eagle Scout. He earned the Distinguished Eagle Scout Award. He was recognized by the local council with the Silver Beaver, by the local region with the Silver Antelope, and by the Boy Scouts of America National Council with the Silver Buffalo. He was also decorated with the Masonic Scoutmasters Award. He is one of very few people who ever earned both the Shofar, the Jewish Adult Leaders Award, and the St. George Award from the Catholic Church as well. He was a vigil member of the Order of the Arrow. So Max's real claim to fame was that he was a metallurgist, and he designed and created things made out of metal. In 1950, he was named as the Scoutmaster for the Daniel Webster Council contingent to the National Jamboree. Without telling anyone, and with his own money, he designed and cast these commemorative belt buckles. He gave 2 to everybody who was going to the Jamboree, with the express directions that they had to wear one and give the other one away. They have since become known as Max Silber Friendship Belt Buckles. They are probably one of the most valuable and most collectible things in all of scouting today. There are 62 of them in this case. There are 67 of them altogether, and they were made to represent all of the different world and national jamborees. They are commemorative of things like Order of the Arrow Vigil Award, Silver Beaver Award, Eagle Scout Award. There's a couple for the museum itself. One has Max's own image on it. And basically, the fewer of them there are in circulation and the older they are, the more valuable they are as well. There's one here from the World Jamboree of 1979, which was to have been in Iran. 1979 was a real good year not to go to Iran because there was a war breaking out. So those were not even ever circulated, and they are, as a result, very, very valuable. So we talked a couple minutes ago about how scouting grew to include younger boys in Cub Scouting in the early 1930s. Senior Scouting began in 1935. It was for boys 15 years and older, and it included Explorer Scouts, which had an advanced camping focus, Sea Scouts, which had a nautical focus, and Air Scouts, which had an aviation focus. In 1949, the program names changed to Explorers, Sea Explorers, and Air Explorers, and the age was lowered to 14. When a Boy Scout turned 14, he automatically became an Explorer and could either continue in his troop, join an Explorer crew within his troop, or join a separate Explorer unit. These days, exploring has become more of a career-oriented emphasis. You will find many Explorer posts these days are sponsored by ambulance companies or fire departments or police departments. And a lot of the jobs that they develop skills for are the social services of those nature. A little over 20 years ago, Scouting developed a new division called Venture Scouting, and that was to concentrate on the adventure part of Scouting. And so these days you will find venture crews who specialize in things like rock climbing or shooting sports or whitewater rafting or wilderness camping. And exploring is, as we said, more the pre-vocational social service skills. Scouting continued to develop specialty subsets when STEM Scouting was created in the last decade, specifically for science, technology, engineering, and math skills. Requirement 4 for Scouting Heritage Merit Badge asks you to do one of 3 possibilities. A is to attend either a BSA National Jamboree or a Scout World Jamboree or a National BSA High Adventure Base. Now, there are 4 of those all around the country. The Northern Tier High Adventure Base is a collection of high adventure bases run by the Boy Scouts of America in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness of Minnesota. It actually goes all the way up into and across the border of Canada. It is kind of like Philmont, only in a canoe, and you spend all of your time on the water or portaging your canoe and your gear, 10 days, point to point to point to point to point, camping overnight in wilderness areas along the way. There is also the Florida Sea Base down in the Florida Keys, where all things aquatic take place. You can learn to snorkel and dive and fish and boat and ski and sail. There is the Philmont Scout Ranch, which we have mentioned a little bit of in the context of Wade Phillips. That is 147,000 acres of mountain wilderness in Cimarron, New Mexico, where crews of 10 boys and 2 adult leaders spend 10 days hiking camp to camp to camp and traversing something on the order of 70 to sometimes as many as 100 miles. The latest new high adventure place to exist for Boy Scouts is the Summit in Ghent, West Virginia, which was the site of the World Jamboree last summer, co-hosted by Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and it has become the permanent home for all of the national jamborees that will be held here in the United States for years to come. It also has a backcountry component, much like Philmont, only it is East Coast elevations. So to fulfill that requirement, you need to journal and document your day-to-day experiences, and then upon your return, report to your counselor what you did, what you saw, what you learned. This might include photos or brochures or other documents in your report as well. B is that you could write or visit the National Scouting Museum and obtain information about that facility. Give a short report on what you think the role of that museum is in the scouting program. The National Museum has actually been in 4 or 5 different locations all over the country. It began in 1959 in New Brunswick, New Jersey, when scouting headquarters and the Schiff training reservation was there. When BSA relocated its national headquarters from New Jersey to Texas, the museum closed in 1979 for a number of years. It opened again in 1986 on the campus of Murray State University in Western Kentucky, and then in October of 2002 it moved to Irving, Texas, where the headquarters of BSA is today. In September of 2017, the entire collection and the building were rebuilt and moved to Philmont Scout Ranch in Cimarron, New Mexico, where it opened on May 18th of 2018 with a grand opening in September. Requirement 4C asks you to visit an exhibit of scouting memorabilia or a local museum with a scouting history gallery, or with your parents' permission and counselor's approval, visit with someone in your council who's recognized as a dedicated scouting historian or memorabilia collector. Learn what you can about the history of Boy Scouting and give a short report to your counselor on what you saw and what you learned. So that's where this museum comes in. Lots of our staff and a lot of old-time scouters here in the council have very large personal collections that they would love to show off and tell you all about. Scouting Heritage Merit Badge requirement number 5 is one of only a very few that a trip to our museum here in Manchester, New Hampshire really can't help you with. It has to be done on your own, at home, or back with your own troop or unit. It has multiple parts that have to be accomplished as well. Number 1 is learn about the history of your unit or scouting in your area. These, for example, are the shoulder patches for all the towns in New Hampshire that have had troops over the years before we went to council shoulder patches. You are to interview at least 2 people, one from the past and one from the present, who are associated with your troop or unit. These individuals might be adult leaders, they could be scouts, troop committee members, or representatives of the chartered organization. Find out when your unit was originally chartered, and create a report of your findings on the history of your troop and present it to your patrol or your troop at a court of honor, for example, and then present it to your counselor as well and add it to your troop's library after the fact. The presentation could be an oral or written report, an exhibit, a scrapbook, or a computer presentation like a PowerPoint. Requirement number 6 is another one that you may have to complete on your own and then have your counselor approve and sign off on it. It reads, make a collection of some of your personal patches and other scouting memorabilia. With their permission, you may include items borrowed from family members or friends who have been in scouting in the past, or you may include photographs of these items. Show this collection to your counselor and share what you've learned about the items in the collection. There is no requirement regarding how large or small this collection must be. Here at the Scouting Museum in Manchester, we have a pretty large patch collection. What you're looking at right now is the end cap that includes all of the council shoulder patches from councils all over the country. At the other end of what we call the racetrack, this collection of panels, there is a similar collection for all of the OA flaps from lodges all over the country. In the middle, there are things like the history of merit badges. There are the different scout camps from throughout New England, the medals and buttons of Sea Scouting. On the other side, there are things that are specific to the different districts here in Daniel Webster Council. Requirement number 7 asks you to reproduce the equipment for an old-time scouting game, such as those played at Brownsea Island. You may find one on your own with your counselor's approval, or you could pick one from the Scouting Heritage Merit Badge pamphlet. There's a lot of good information in there. Once you find a game, you are supposed to teach it to the other scouts in your unit and play it with them. And all you have to do is be able to prove that fact to your counselor, and that will fulfill that requirement. One of the things we like to say here at the Scouting Museum is that scouting can take you out of this world. We have an exhibit that shows you 2 examples of former New Hampshire scouts who became astronauts. Colonel Alan Shepard grew up right down the road in Derry, New Hampshire, and he was one of the very first people up in space. He flew Friendship 7 in May of 1961. Later in his career, he was one of the people to go to the moon, and he actually brought this flag to the moon and back and gave it to us to be able to display it for you here at the Scouting Museum. Now that's something you're not going to see every day. This gentleman was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Searfoss, later in his career a full colonel, and he was an Eagle Scout. He was also a space shuttle commander who took this Max Silber Eagle belt buckle up in one of his missions and brought it back and gave it to us to be able to show to you here at the museum. The last of the requirements for Scouting Heritage Merit Badge asks you to interview at least 3 people, different from the people you interviewed about your own troop, who are over the age of 40, who are or were scouts. Find out about their scouting experiences and ask them about the impact scouting has had on their lives. Share what you learned with your counselor. Of all the people that are on the staff here at the Lawrence Lee Scouting Museum, 6 of us are Scouting Heritage Merit Badge counselors. So if you come in here to do the work for the Merit Badge, you will have at least 1 or 2 people who you can talk to fulfill this requirement. And there's usually a couple of other old guys hanging around who have lots of good stories about their days in scouting, and they'd be happy to share that with you as well. So that, my friends, is a quick look at the Lawrence Lee Scouting Museum and Max I. Silber Scouting Library here at Camp Carpenter in Manchester, New Hampshire. Thanks for joining us, and we hope that we left you with more questions than answers, because we want you to come back and spend some time here on your own. We've only shown you about a quarter of the things that are actually on display and on exhibit here inside the museum. There are thousands more items in a conservancy on the property that we swap in and out from time to time, so hopefully any 2 times that you come, it's never the exact same collection. We invite you to come sometime when you can spend more time here. We're open most Wednesdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. when there are actually members of our staff who are here working behind the scenes. And most of the time we are open Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. as well. Now, we are only staffed by volunteer docents, and sometimes their schedules conflict with when we want to be open. So the solution to that is that we could always use more volunteers. If you have an interest in scouting or in history or in museum science or library science or administration of collections like this, we would love to talk to you and see if we can get you involved to spend some time here as well. We also welcome donations of time and money and merchandise. Much of what you've seen in today's tour has been given to us by families whose scouters have either passed on or are no longer active in the organization, but they wanted their artifacts to have a good home, and so we keep them, we display them. Sometimes we will sell them off as a fundraiser as well, so that we can go out and procure other things, like this guy, who we found online. This is actually the artist's model of a statue that exists life-size up on the town common in Plymouth, New Hampshire. And this is the only one of its kind. I can tell you that it came to us in so many pieces through some very careless shipping, and our chairman spent better part of 2 months at the conference table with plaster of Paris and glue and put them back together. So now he's safe behind glass. But we welcome you to come back sometime when you can spend even more time and see more of the things that we have to offer here at the Scouting Museum at Camp Carpenter in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm Joe Bedrisky. Thanks a lot. It's been fun spending time with you. We'll see you soon on the trail.